The most dangerous lie you will ever be told will not come from an enemy. It will come from you. Not the conscious you, not the part that makes decisions and sets boundaries and tells itself it has finally learned from the past. The other part, the part that works quietly, below the surface, assembling evidence and dismissing contradictions and constructing an image of another person so convincing, so detailed, so emotionally necessary, that by the time reality finally contradicts it, you will choose reality last. You have done this, not because you are naive, not because you are weak, because you are human. And the human mind does not experience other people directly. It builds them. It takes the raw material of who someone actually is, their words, their behavior, their silences, and it fills in everything else with what it needs, with what it hopes, with what it cannot afford to be wrong about. And then it defends that construction, quietly, persistently, against every piece of evidence that threatens it. Think about the last person you made excuses for. Not once, as a pattern, as something you returned to automatically, a reflex that activated the moment anyone around you expressed doubt. Your best friend said something careful and measured, and you heard it as judgment. Your family asked a question that felt like an accusation, and you had answers. You always had answers, because you understood this person in a way the people around you simply didn't. You had access to a version of them, a real version, you were certain, that made everything explicable. The distance that came without warning, the words that landed wrong, the moments that, if you are honest with yourself right now, were never actually ambiguous. You explained all of it, fluently, automatically. That is not love. That is not perception. That is a psychological defense system running at full capacity, and it was not protecting you from them. It was protecting the image of them that you had built inside your own mind. That image had a name. Carl Jung spent 40 years trying to make people understand what that name meant, and most of the content that invokes his ideas online gets it almost entirely wrong, which is exactly why this video exists. But before Jung, there was Machiavelli. And the reason this begins with Machiavelli is not because this is a history lesson. It is because Machiavelli made an observation about human psychology 500 years ago that is more precise, more uncomfortable, and more directly applicable to your life right now than almost anything written since. In 1513, Niccolò Machiavelli was in a Florentine prison. He had been tortured, stripped of his political position, removed from the world he had spent his entire adult life learning to navigate. And in that silence, in the specific and brutal clarity that only comes when everything external has been taken away, he began to write. Not to advise tyrants, not to celebrate cruelty, but because he had watched something happen over and over again throughout his life, and he needed to understand it. Intelligent men, experienced men, men with every advantage, resources, information, sophisticated political instincts, destroying themselves, not through stupidity, not through bad luck, through one specific and recurring failure, the inability to see people as they actually were, rather than as they needed them to be. Most people read The Prince and see a manual for manipulation. They miss the emotional core entirely. The Prince is a document written by a man sitting in prison, reflecting on a lifetime of watching human beings, himself included, construct fictions about the people around them, defend those fictions against reality, and then suffer the consequences when reality could no longer be deferred. He was not writing about tyrants. He was writing about you. Now here is where it gets uncomfortable, and where most content about psychology stops, because this next part is genuinely difficult to hear. Carl Jung did not disagree with Machiavelli, not fundamentally. What Jung added was the interior dimension, the explanation for why this happens, why intelligent, perceptive, emotionally sophisticated people build fictions about the people they love, why the mind constructs these images in the first place, and why dismantling them is not a matter of simply deciding to see more clearly. Jung said, and this is the part that will sit with you after this video ends, that what we call falling in love, what we call deep connection, what we call finally being understood, is, at its psychological core, a projection. Not entirely. The other person is real. Their qualities are real. But the experience of profound recognition, of feeling seen, of encountering someone who seems to contain exactly what you have been looking for, that experience is not purely about them. It is about you. Specifically, it is about the parts of you that feel too dangerous, too vulnerable, too unfinished to look at directly. The psyche, and Jung documented this across thousands of case studies across decades of clinical work, takes those unprocessed parts and casts them outward, onto a person, onto a relationship, and then experiences that relationship as if the projection were objective reality. You are not falling in love with them. You are falling in love with the parts of yourself you cannot yet face. Let that breathe for a moment. Because if you felt something shift when you read that, if something in you wanted to immediately argue against it or immediately recognized it, either response is telling you something important. Julius Caesar was not killed by more powerful enemies. He was killed by his own psychology. And the mechanism that killed him is the same mechanism that has ended relationships in your life. Not with violence, not with political assassination, but with the same essential structure, the same refusal, the same cost. Caesar needed to believe he was invincible, loved, chosen. That need, and Plutarch documents this with a specificity that reads almost like a psychological case study, caused him to filter out information systematically. Not because he lacked intelligence, he was extraordinarily intelligent. Because the information, if processed accurately, would have threatened something he valued more than accuracy: the story he was living inside. The narrative in which he was the protagonist that history had selected. His advisors warned him, repeatedly. Different people, different occasions, the same essential message. The ground beneath him was not what he believed it to be. Each warning was received and dismissed. Not because he couldn't understand the words, because understanding them fully would have required him to revise an internal image that had become, by that point, more real to him than the external situation it was supposed to represent. Now ask yourself this. Think about the last time someone who loved you, someone with no motive to hurt you, no agenda, no reason to lie, tried to tell you something about a person you were invested in, something careful, something that came from genuine concern. And you heard it, and you processed it, and somewhere in the processing it became something else. It became their limitation, their inability to understand the full picture. They're missing the complexity that you alone had access to. That was not discernment. That was Caesar in a Florentine prison, a decade before Machiavelli sat in one, running the same program, producing the same result. Machiavelli writes, not in The Prince, but in Discourses on Livy, where his real thinking fully surfaces, that the collapse of great men almost never originates in the strength of their enemies. It originates in a specific interior moment. The moment when a man's image of the world becomes more important to him than the world itself. When he stops reading reality and starts defending a story. At that precise moment, Machiavelli is exact about this. The man does not lose his intelligence. He turns it against himself. All of its sophistication, all of its pattern recognition, all of its accumulated experience, redirected, weaponized, in service of a fiction. The most dangerous person in your life is not the one who lies to you. Lies are relatively detectable once you are actually looking. The most dangerous person is the one whose presence confirms what your psychology has already decided it needs to believe. You did not find them accidentally. You chose them, at least in part, because of what they allowed you to maintain about yourself and the world. And you will keep choosing versions of them, in different faces, different cities, different decades of your life, until the mechanism itself becomes something you can see clearly enough to interrupt. But here is what Machiavelli could not explain, and what nobody in his century had the framework to explain. He could see the pattern from the outside. He could document it, name it, trace it across empires and republics and the careers of great men. What he could not do was go inside, could not answer the question that actually matters, not what this failure looks like, but why it happens. Why the intelligent, the perceptive, the emotionally sophisticated are not immune to it. Why, in fact, they are often its most reliable victims. That answer did not exist until a Swiss psychiatrist 4 centuries later began doing something no one before him had done with the same systematic rigor, going into the interior of the human mind and mapping what he found there. And what Jung found, when he finally named it clearly, will make you look back at every significant relationship of your life and see it completely differently. Not more painfully, more honestly, and for the first time, more accurately than you ever have before. Jung called it projection. And if you have encountered that word before, in a self-help book, in a therapy session, in the kind of content that reduces complex psychological architecture to a 3-second caption, forget what you think it means. Because the version that circulates in popular culture is so flattened, so stripped of its actual structure, that engaging with it does more harm than good. It gives people the vocabulary without the understanding. And vocabulary without understanding is one of the most dangerous combinations in psychology, because it creates the illusion of self-knowledge while leaving the mechanism completely intact. What Jung actually meant was something far more precise and far more unsettling. Every human being carries an interior territory that never fully surfaces into conscious awareness. Not because of failure, not because of weakness, because of necessity. From the earliest stages of psychological development, the mind learns, with extraordinary efficiency, which parts of the self are acceptable in the environment it is growing inside, and which parts are not. Which qualities will be met with love, and which will be met with withdrawal. Which dimensions of emotional life will be rewarded, and which will be treated as dangerous, embarrassing, or simply invisible. The parts that are not acceptable do not disappear, they go underground. They form what Jung called the shadow, and he was not being poetic, he was being clinical. The shadow is the precise, accumulated repository of everything you learned before you had the conscious capacity to question the lesson that you could not afford to be. Everything that got pushed below the threshold of what you are willing to acknowledge about yourself. Every quality that felt too vulnerable, too shameful, too contradictory to the person you needed to become in order to survive your particular childhood in your particular environment. And the shadow, Jung found, is not passive. It does not wait quietly in the dark. It operates. It moves through your life with a specific and recognizable signature. And one of its primary mechanisms is this. It takes the unprocessed material you cannot face directly, and it casts it outward, onto people, onto relationships, onto the person across from you who suddenly seems to contain something extraordinary, something you cannot name precisely, but that produces in you a quality of fascination, of recognition, of finally. That is projection, not idealization, not wishful thinking. A deep structural process by which the psyche relocates its own unfinished work into the external world, and then experiences that world as if the projection were independently, objectively real. From the inside, it does not feel like distortion. It feels like coming home. That specific quality. The sense of recognition, of being understood at a depth no one else has reached, of encountering someone who seems to hold exactly what you have been missing. That feeling is the precise phenomenological signature of projection activating. The reason it feels like recognition is because, in a very specific sense, it is recognition. You are recognizing something, not in them, in yourself, cast outward, wearing their face, speaking in their voice, experienced as arriving from outside when it was constructed from within. This is why it is so completely resistant to outside correction. When someone who loves you tries to say something careful about this person, something that comes from genuine concern, from observations they have made quietly over time, you do not receive it as information. You receive it as an intrusion, as an attack. Because at the level of unconscious process, that is precisely what it feels like. The projection has become structural. It is not simply a story about another person anymore. It is a piece of load-bearing psychological architecture. It is holding something in you together that does not yet have another way to be held. Dismantling it does not feel like updating a perception. It feels like being asked to remove a wall that is keeping the ceiling up. And so you defend it, fluently, automatically, with reasons that feel entirely rational, because the intelligence that is generating those reasons is real, even if what it is protecting is a fiction. Jung documented the specific form this takes in Ion, 1951, though he had been mapping its structure across decades of clinical work long before that. He called it anima projection in men, animus projection in women, and was careful to clarify that the mechanism itself operated far beyond the gender categories he was working within. The structure, regardless of its specific form, is always recognizably the same. There are qualities within you that could not be integrated consciously. For a person raised in an environment that treated emotional vulnerability as weakness, the unintegrated material might be their own capacity for depth, for tenderness, for the interior richness that their environment told them had no legitimate place in their life. For someone raised in an environment that punished directness, the unintegrated material might be their own authority, their own capacity for decisive and independent action. These qualities do not vanish because they were suppressed. They relocate. And when you encounter someone who seems to embody the unintegrated quality naturally, who seems to carry it effortlessly, as if it costs them nothing, the projection locks onto them with a force that produces, from the inside, the feeling of profound and irreplaceable connection. You are not drawn to who they are. You are drawn to who you have not yet allowed yourself to become. Sit with that, not as a concept, as a question directed at the specific relationships that have marked your life most deeply, the ones that felt different from the beginning, the ones that produced that particular quality of intensity, the feeling that this person was not just a person but something more, something necessary, something whose loss would not be proportional to ordinary grief. Ask yourself honestly, what was it specifically that you saw in them? What quality, what capacity, what dimension of life that their presence seemed to make suddenly available? Because that answer is not a description of them. It is a map of the interior territory you had not yet claimed as your own. Now here is the part that most psychology content approaches and then retreats from, because it is genuinely uncomfortable, because it does not resolve into something clean, because it places a specific and difficult form of responsibility onto you that is much harder to sit with than the alternative. The people who hurt you most were not primarily doing something to you. They were the location where your psychology had placed a weight it could not carry alone. They were the external site of an internal process. And when they, inevitably because they were human, because no actual person can indefinitely sustain a projection that was never about them, when they behaved in ways inconsistent with what you had constructed around them, the experience was not simply disappointment. It was structural collapse. It felt like betrayal not because they had necessarily betrayed you in the ordinary sense, but because the architecture built onto them had failed. And the failure felt like it came from them because that is where you had placed it. The grief was real. Every cell of it was real, but its object was never fully who you thought it was. You were mourning a self-portrait, rendered in extraordinary detail, hung on the frame of a real person, and experienced as if the portrait and the person were the same thing. When the real person moved, as real people always do, the portrait fell. And here is where Machiavelli and Jung converge, and where that convergence produces the single most uncomfortable insight this entire script contains. Machiavelli's core observation, running underneath everything in The Prince and surfacing most explicitly in the discourses, is that human beings are not primarily defeated by external forces. They are defeated by their need for a particular story to remain intact. Caesar needed to be invincible. The Republic needed to believe it was loved by the people it governed. Every leader Machiavelli dissects falls not because power abandoned them, but because they reached the point where the story of their power had become more valuable to them than an accurate reading of their actual situation. At that moment, the judgment does not disappear. It inverts. It becomes a precision instrument for constructing justifications rather than assessments. Jung's core insight is structurally identical, seen from the interior rather than the exterior. The shadow does not remain inert, it relocates. It enters the room wearing someone else's face, and we pursue it, or we attack it, or we organize the entire architecture of our emotional life around managing our proximity to it, depending on whether the projection feels in that particular moment like salvation or like threat. What Machiavelli called the inability to see clearly, Jung called shadow possession. 4 centuries apart, the same human failure, the same interior mechanism, the same collapse, wearing different clothes across different eras. Every relationship you have ever projected onto was, at the level of psychological structure, a strategic position you were defending, not a person you were seeing. And here is the line, the single line that this entire script has been building toward. Both parts of it. Every argument, every historical layer, every psychological mechanism has been moving toward this. You did not fall for their mask. You fell for the mirror they held up to the part of you that most needed to be seen. That is not metaphor. That is mechanism. And it is why the solution is never what the obvious response suggests. The solution is not better judgment about people. It is not more caution. It is not a more rigorous vetting process for who you allow close to you. Those responses treat the symptom with complete precision, while leaving the underlying mechanism untouched. And an untouched mechanism will find new material. It will construct the next projection from whoever is available, with the same sophistication, the same intensity, the same absolute subjective conviction that this time the perception is clear and the connection is real. The only intervention that addresses the mechanism itself is what Jung called individuation. And individuation is not a technique. It is not a 30-day practice. It is not something you complete. It is a lifelong and non-linear confrontation with the interior, a gradual process of pulling projection back into the self, of learning to recognize the specific quality of intensity, the fascination, the devastation, the sense that this particular person is uniquely necessary as information, not about them, about the part of you that the projection has activated. This does not produce coldness. Jung was explicit about this. Withdrawing projection does not mean withdrawing from genuine connection. It means something more demanding than either naive openness or defensive detachment. It means developing the capacity to see the person who is actually there, not the portrait you painted onto them, not the resolution of your oldest wound wearing their face, the actual person, with their actual limitations, their actual qualities, their actual and completely independent inner life that exists entirely outside the requirements of your psychology. That capacity is rarer than almost any other human achievement, because it requires the one thing the ego is architecturally designed to prevent. It requires you to see yourself first. And this is where most people stop. Not because the work becomes impossible, but because this is the precise point where it becomes real, where it crosses from intellectual understanding into something that would require actual change. And the distance between understanding something and being willing to let that understanding alter how you live is where most psychology content leaves you standing alone. Machiavelli died having never fully solved the problem he spent his life diagnosing. He could map it with extraordinary precision. He could trace it across centuries of human failure. What he could not do, what the framework he built did not give him the tools to do, was go inside. Could not answer why, could only document what. Jung went inside, and what he found there, in the dreams, in the clinical material, in his own interior work documented in the Red Book, was not a problem to be solved. It was a process to be entered. Individuation does not end with clarity. It ends with the capacity to tolerate ambiguity. to hold the tension between who you have needed people to be and who they actually are, without collapsing into either illusion or cynicism. That capacity has a name. Jung called it psychological maturity, not as a compliment, as a precise description of something most people never fully reach, not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack the desire, but because the work required is the specific kind of work that the part of you doing the avoiding is also the part responsible for initiating the confrontation. The day you stop needing people to be what you require them to be is the first day you are capable of actually knowing them. Not safe, not comfortable, but for the first time, true. The harder question, the one this video has been circling without landing on directly, the one that lives underneath every insight covered here, is not who you have been projecting onto. It is what, specifically, the projection has been protecting you from seeing in yourself. That question does not have a quick answer. It has a direction. And the direction requires something most people never do. Not because they cannot, but because nothing has yet made the cost of not doing it clear enough. What made the cost clear for you, and when, is something only you know. But if something in this video shifted something in how you are holding that question right now, if the framework of Machiavelli and Jung together produced a recognition that feels less like learning something new and more like finally having language for something you have always, somewhere, known, then you already understand that the next question is not intellectual. It is personal, it is specific, and it is waiting for you. Not in the next video, in the next honest moment you allow yourself.